All right. Hey guys, and welcome back. I'm actually recording this for a second time, so I'm going to try not to be too upset as I'm doing this. I lost my whole first recording because my voice was modulated for some reason on my computer to be like, and President Andrew Johnson. So you didn't want to hear that. Anyway, moving right along. We're talking today in this lecture about presidential reconstruction. Remember, Reconstruction is the era after the Civil War when the North and the South are trying to patch things up. Mostly the North is trying to get the South to come back into the Union because the South was the one that left. And so there's three phases of Reconstruction. Remember, presidential Reconstruction begins under Abraham Lincoln in 1863 during the war while it's still happening, and it continues through under Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is going to make a lot of Northerners and particularly Republicans very upset with his Reconstruction policies, which will then enact the next era of Reconstruction known as congressional or radical Reconstruction, with the radical Republicans in Congress taking over the reins of how Reconstruction is going to look. And then finally, the final phase, I just call it like the collapse or the fall of Reconstruction, when Reconstruction comes to an end by 1877. Now, this era of Reconstruction we talked about last time, it is very controversial today, especially with all of the very difficult race relations that we have going on in the United States. A lot of the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of their protests that we've seen over the summer of this year that I'm recording this, 2020, are in response to what we call systemic racism. And a lot of those systemic racist issues developed beginning during Reconstruction. And they were not addressed, and they still are not being fully addressed to this day, although civil rights, which took place in the 1960s and 1970s, 100 years after Reconstruction, did do a lot to marginalize a lot of the deficits from Reconstruction. So that's why it's kind of seen as a controversial time period, because what was won was not enough, and what was lost was devastating. There are three different ways of kind of remembering Reconstruction, and remembering something historically is why we do this. Like, how is something viewed? How has it shaped us today based on our memory of it? And for every single different person, they might have a different way of viewing something. But there are three major narratives when it comes to remembering Reconstruction that you should be aware of. The first one is the reconciliationist approach. Now, reconciliation means trying to forgive and forget, trying to just move past this terrible struggle that was the Civil War that left, over 700,000 American soldiers on both sides dead. So the reconciliationist view doesn't really address any of the struggles and challenges that African Americans were facing. It's more just in line with trying to move past the Civil War. Let bygones be bygones, brother versus brother. Let's shake it out. Let's hug it out, man. Let's just come back together. It's kind of like that constitutional unionist approach, that party that was created right before the Civil War to try to head it off, regardless of the issue of slavery. Um, the second view of Reconstruction is the white supremacist view, which is more of what we talked about last time with the lost cause dogma, or the lost cause idea. The idea that many Southerners have, the Civil War was a just war, that Southerners were fighting to preserve their Southern way of life, and basically ignores the downside of that Southern way of life, that it basically revolved around slavery. For white supremacist views on Reconstruction, they saw this as a time period when they were trying to affirm and keep that Southern way of life, using Black codes and other things. The rise of the white supremacist groups such as the Knights of the White Circle, the Ku Klux Klan, those were seen as heroes and saviors of the white race, as radical Republicans, carpetbaggers, scallywags, and African Americans were trying to undo their culture in the South. And then finally, the third approach, the third memory or way we have of viewing Reconstruction today, comes from the abolitionist perspective. And obviously, this is the view of like radical Republicans and other abolitionists, that Reconstruction was a brief shining window when you actually had people who'd been born and lived as slaves suddenly being free, being given citizenship, being given equal rights, and being given, at least if they were men, the right to vote, and using that power to become leaders in not only their state governments, but on the national government as well. You had African Americans actually elected to the House of Representatives, and 2 were even elected to the Senate. One became a governor, the governor of Louisiana. And because you had African Americans during this brief window of Reconstruction actually having office and exercising their rights, it was a brief window into what could have been. But then tragically, of course, it all ends by 1877. So again, it's this brief shining moment that will then kind of be swept under by Jim Crow laws and segregation for the next 100 years until we get to the Civil Rights Movement, when we'll see these issues again resurface and the fight again resume for civil rights. All right, so those are the 3 ways of kind of viewing Reconstruction. Let's get into the details, though, of presidential Reconstruction, this first phase. It begins under President Lincoln in 1863. Remember, that's when the Emancipation Proclamation is being enacted on January 1st. Lincoln is already at this point, he's pretty confident that eventually the North will win due to its overwhelming numbers and population and resources. But he is trying to think about ways to reintegrate Southern society back into the United States during the war. Lincoln's approach is called the 10% plan, and under it, he's basically going to require 10% of the voting population, those Southern white men who had voted in the 1860 election, 10% of those in each Southern state, there's 11 states of the Confederacy, would need to give an oath of loyalty to the United States government. Now, once they had given this oath of loyalty, 10% of those who had voted in 1860 in each state, then that state would be allowed to re-enter the Union. It would have to draft a new state government. So this new state constitution of theirs, it would need to include a provision that basically ratified the 13th Amendment, which would be, the abolition of slavery, period, the ending of all slavery. And then they could be readmitted and start to be able to seat their representatives back in Congress, in the federal government. And so that was a way to very quickly bring these Southerners back into the fold, back into the United States. It is a rather lenient approach. It did, however, say that key Confederate military and political leaders, such as like Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee, the head general, it said key individuals like this would not be allowed to go into political service again or have a political say, that they would have to spend some time probably in jail or out of public life. Now, because of how easy or lenient Lincoln's 10% plan was to Southerners, because Lincoln is not interested in punishing the South for what they've done, he's wanting to quickly reintegrate them into American society. Many Northerners, many Republicans of his own party, felt that Lincoln's approach was not going to be for them, that it was, again, too lenient. And so we don't know how Lincoln, the master politician, he was a great president. We don't know how he would have gotten Congress onto his side, or if he would have been able to get Congress onto his side, because of course he is assassinated at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865, just days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse to Grant. And so we don't know if Lincoln would have been able to get his plan going. There were already some southern states that were under Union control that were starting to enact Lincoln's plan, such as Tennessee, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Of course, the next president, the vice president of Lincoln, is Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson wasn't Lincoln's first vice president. His first vice president was actually this guy with this very alliterative name, Hannibal Hamlin. Yeah, Hannibal, like y'all don't know what I'm talking about, the guy who eats other people. Anyway, Hannibal Hamlin was Lincoln's first vice president, and he had some health problems, and Lincoln's basically going to, I think he might die in office, or Lincoln basically dumps him. One way or the other, when Lincoln runs for re-election in 1864, he is going to appoint a new vice president for his ticket. And he chooses Andrew Johnson because Andrew Johnson was one of the very few high-ranking federal officials, Democrats in the South, that sided with the Union, that refused to secede when his state of Tennessee seceded. So Andrew Johnson supported the United States, even though he was a Southerner and even though he was a Democrat. Because he was a senator from Tennessee that did this, once Tennessee is taken over by Grant and Sherman after Henry's and Fort Donelson and Shiloh and all of that, Johnson is going to be appointed the military governor of the state of Tennessee. And so that's from that position that he then becomes Lincoln's vice president. Now, a couple things about Andrew Johnson that you really need to be aware of is that he is a very difficult man to get along with, and he hated a lot of people. He's not a very friendly dude, and he's not really well educated. Andrew Johnson had been born pretty poor white trash, you might even say. He learned to read because his wife taught him. And so because of his background, his poor background, his illiteracy, he often was looked down upon by many of the wealthier Southern Democrats. They kind of snubbed him. And so he has a chip on his shoulder, a serious chip on his shoulder when it came to the planter class. That's the first group that he hates. Secondly, he is a Southerner. He is a Democrat at this time, and he was a slaveholder. When it comes to his views on African Americans, he was definitely a racist. And while he will share in the view with Lincoln that states needed to approve of the 13th Amendment, he would not go any farther than that in securing equality or any other form of civil rights for newly emancipated slaves. So he's a racist. He doesn't like African Americans. He hates the rich planter class of the South. So he hates many of his own people. And he is also a Southern Democrat who believes strongly in the idea of states' rights, now becoming, the president of the United States after Lincoln's assassination. So keep all of that in the back of your mind. It's going to be really important to why Andrew Johnson becomes the first president in our nation's history that will be impeached, although not removed. Just as a side note, we've had 3 presidents that have actually been impeached, none of which have been removed by the Senate. To be impeached means that formal charges of disapproval, basically, were brought against you in the House of Representatives if you're the president. And then those charges, that trial goes over to the Senate, where the Senate can vote to either keep you in office or remove you. In all 3 cases of impeachment, the Senate has not voted to remove. The first president that was impeached was Andrew Johnson during the Reconstruction era, right after the Civil War. The second president won't be till like 130 years later in the 1990s. That was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was famously impeached for basically lying under oath, committing perjury when he said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman," referring to the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And then finally, the last president to be impeached was, of course, Donald Trump in the very year that I'm recording this, January of 2020. Donald Trump was impeached for obstruction of justice, trying to convince a foreign power to subvert our democracy with Ukraine. So those are the 3 presidents in our nation's history that have been impeached, Johnson being the first. What Johnson is going to do with his presidential reconstruction plan is basically take Lincoln's approach and make it even easier, okay, even more lenient. So with the 10% plan that Lincoln had, remember Lincoln required 10% of the voting population from the 1860 election to give this oath of allegiance. Johnson is going to require 10%, period, ambiguous, of the population in order to basically qualify to write a new state constitution. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. It basically means 10% of like whoever's there, whoever shows up. So it doesn't have to be 10% of all those who voted in 1860. It could just be like, 5 people show up. If even one of them is willing to give the oath of allegiance, well then, hey, there you go. New state government for you. So it's super easy. Now, on top of that, remember Johnson is vindictive towards the rich elites of the South, the planter class. So he added an extra thing in there that was just a personal thing for him, to where if you owned over $20,000 worth in money or property, you would have to personally appeal for a pardon to the President of the United States, to Andrew Johnson himself. Now, he wants them to grovel, he wants them to beg for a pardon. But what is end up going to happening for most of these Confederates is that these are Southern men of honor and class and blah, blah, blah. So they're going to send their wives, they're going to send their ladies to basically go to Washington, D.C. and appeal for a pardon in front of Johnson. And how's Johnson going to refuse these, poor Southern women? And so most of them that are asking a pardon, I think every single one of them gets a pardon. And with this super easy, lenient approach to being able to come back into the Union, I think every Southern state except for Texas was able to get a new state constitution going by 1866. And that's where you're going to have these new Southern Congresses elected and waiting to be seated in the next congressional cycle. When Northerners see these new congressmen coming out of these new Southern state governments that have just been approved under Johnson's Presidential Reconstruction plan, they are horrified. And why, you might ask? Well, because a lot of these Southern representatives that were just voted in under these new state governments look a lot like the Confederate leadership. Like, for instance, the most glaringly ridiculous example of this is Alexander H. Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, being elected the brand new senator of Georgia. He's coming to Washington, happy as you please, saying, I'm ready to take my seat in the Senate. And radical Republicans in Congress, they're like, no, that is not going to happen. And so that's going to be a major impetus in the midterm elections, giving Republicans the majority to basically put a halt to Johnson's presidential reconstruction. Remember, Johnson is a Democrat, he is a Southerner, and he and the Republican Congress are going to be clashing big time over what direction Reconstruction is going to take. All right, now let's talk about sharecropping. Under Johnson's Reconstruction plan, all of that 40 acres and a mule stuff that had been issued, say, with like Sherman's Special Field Order 15 back in the beginning of 1865, before the war was even over, is going to be thrown out the window. Okay, and again, that's where that 40 acres and a mule idea becomes like sort of a false promise, a broken promise for many African Americans. Sherman and Secretary of War Stanton, they had promised, and this had begun to take place, where the Sea Islands and like 400,000 acres of coastal farmland in Georgia and South Carolina were ceded over to newly freed African Americans. And each family was supposed to get 40 acres and one of the Army mules that Sherman didn't need anymore. And with that was what they'd said in that very important meeting in Atlanta. That was what these newly freed slaves needed in order to be able to secure a life and true freedom for themselves. Because freedom wasn't just being out of bondage. Freedom was being able to build a life for your family and support you and your family. And they needed land to do that. So that was this 40 acres and a mule. Under Johnson's plan, Southern whites, once they had been pardoned and once their new state governments were written in their new state constitutions, Southern whites got back all of their previous property. And it was actually like Union soldiers that, and the Freedmen's Bureau, that had to go in and explain to these newly freed African Americans that were just starting to settle in, like, hey, no, I'm sorry, you got to go. It was awful. It was, again, broken promise. And so that was what was going on. That was another point of immense hatred. But as far as the land went, for most of these former slaves, since they're not going to be getting land for themselves, that's not going to be happening. They're going to be tied to the land that they were once slaves on, and tied to a life of almost indentured servitude and debt to their former slave masters. This is the system known as sharecropping. This is where it comes from directly after the Civil War. And it is enforced by most of these Southern state governments in what became known as the Black Codes, which included like many vagrancy laws, which basically kept African Americans in this role and severely limited their economic opportunities. So, what is sharecropping? It is where a freedman, a recently freed slave, would rent a portion of the plantation that they used to be a slave on from their former slave master. Since they did not have money to actually rent this, they would have to borrow that money or just basically promise at the end of the year to give a share of their crop to pay back their rent for that land that they're going to be staying on. They would also need to secure resources in order to build a new house for themselves on this rented property, and they would need to secure tools, implements, and even farm animals such as donkeys or mules or horses or oxen to pull their plows in order for them to successfully farm. All of these things cost money. Money is something they do not have, so they are severely already at the start of this process in debt to their landowner, their former master. And again, at the end of the season, they try to pay off this debt with the share of their crop. Now, keep in mind, while this is developing for these former slaves in the South, you also have many poor Southern whites returning from the war who are also going to be trying to go back to their life as a subsistent farmer. That was what most of the whites were, poor subsistent farmers, the yeoman farmers. They began having to do a system called the crop lien, where they would pledge a portion of their crop as collateral, which they would pay back at the end of the season to the merchants or the wealthy plantation owner in order to pay off their debts. So they too are going into debt and eventually will become sharecroppers. And in fact, by the 1930s, there's actually going to be more poor white sharecroppers, these poor farmers tied to the land, than there will be African American, because we'll see in like the beginning of the World War I era in the 19-teens up through the 1920s and beyond into World War II, millions of African Americans are going to leave the South, get out of that racist, segregated, Jim Crow South. They're going to go to northern cities. It's not that there wasn't racism in the North. There certainly was, but there were opportunities, especially created by the world wars, that will draw African Americans up to those northern cities. And so again, by the 30s, you'll actually see more poor whites as these sharecroppers down in the South. Here's what a plantation looked like going from before the Civil War to about 15 years after the Civil War, once the system of sharecropping had developed. So I want you to pay attention to before the Civil War. Here's the plantation house. This is where the master's house. And here's the slave quarters where the slaves lived. So this is the plantation, maybe about 40 or 50 acres. Okay. Now look 15 years after the Civil War. In the system of sharecropping, you still have the plantation house, the landlord's house now. And then you have the slave quarters no longer there. Instead, all of these slaves are now living in their own built little homes. They're not great. They're basically shacks. There might be a school or church. Maybe it was in part founded during the era of the Freedmen's Bureau. And these sharecropping homes, they are in charge of their own little land, but they all are kind of having to pay allegiance to the landlord there. So that's the system of sharecropping. All right, so that is what is developing. Remember that for President Andrew Johnson, he's going to pardon nearly all of the white Southerners. He's going to give back the white Southerners who had just been in open rebellion against the United States. He's going to give them back their land that had been taken from them by the Union Army and given to African Americans. He will give it back to the whites. He is going to appoint governors to call for state conventions that would establish loyal governments in the South using like the 10% plan. But again, it was ambiguous about how many it took and about the oaths themselves. And so it would be very easy for Southern states to reestablish their own state governments as long as they ratified the 13th Amendment. But very quickly, they start to enact these black codes. Black codes are going to be where African Americans will have to follow these laws, kind of like the slave codes that had existed previously. And every state had a different set because these were state laws. But in general, they prevented newly freed African Americans from renting or owning land. They're going to prevent African Americans from testifying in court against whites. They're going to prevent African Americans from serving on juries. The only way they could be on court is if they were in court against another African American. They're going to restrict what jobs African Americans could get. They're going to also restrict the amount of pay that African Americans could receive. And of course, they will prevent across the South African Americans from being able to vote, to be able to change any of this. The most important part of the Black Codes you need to remember, though, is that second bullet. They included in every state contract labor systems. So this is where they included vagrancy laws. To be a vagrant, it means you get in trouble under the law for not having a job, okay? So you could literally be arrested in the South for being an African American who couldn't prove that you were employed. You would have to sign a labor contract, typically with your landlord for a year, a 1-year term, proving that you were like a sharecropper with them for 1 year. And then you'd have to renew it before January 1st of the following year to still qualify. If you did not have one of these labor contracts, then you were considered a vagrant and could be picked up by the authorities for breaking the law. Now, once you were imprisoned, then under the 13th Amendment, there is a loophole that basically allows for people who are imprisoned to then have to, or they could basically be forced to serve hard time, which basically means they're being re-enslaved. If you are a prisoner, you can be forced into hard labor or enslavement. And this was a way for whites in the South to reassert their dominance following their loss in the Civil War, for them to try to hang on to their Southern way of life, or that plantation, slave-based agricultural system that had developed in the antebellum era. The Black Codes were meant to oppress African Americans and keep them tied to the land, to keep them in that system of sharecropping, basically, which was the new form of slavery. Now, was it as bad as actual slavery? No, okay. And most African Americans, given the choice between working as a wage laborer under their former master or working as a sharecropper, they chose sharecropping because then at least they were in charge of their own productivity in their own little area of land, and they could get some autonomy, some independence. But still, they are tied to that land. They don't have opportunities. It's hard for them to get an education because remember how limited in resources and manpower the Freedmen's Bureau was. And so they are going to be very restricted. But it was not the same as slavery, because slavery is the worst. Under slavery, you don't have any choices whatsoever. Okay, and we're gonna go ahead and end there. And I'm sorry if I rushed through some of that, guys. Again, that was my second time filming that. I can't believe my voice recorder did that the first time. But anyway, next lecture, we will finish Andrew Johnson's Presidential Reconstruction, and we'll see what the radical Republicans can get up to with congressional reconstruction. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will talk to you later. Bye.